10 days after the South African Grand Prix, the country's president F.W. de Klerk admitted that South Africa had secretly built 6 nuclear weapons, with Israeli and Taiwanese help during the 1980s, due to fears about Soviet-backed governments in Angola and Mozambique, but that they had all been dismantled in 1989 before South Africa signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was the first instance, that anyone knew about anyway, of a country developing nuclear weapons and then voluntarily giving them up again. A branch of the Samaritans in Liverpool received a phone call on a Saturday lunchtime in late March, claiming to be from the IRA, saying they'd planted a bomb outside a branch of Boots the Chemist. The Merseyside and neighbouring Cheshire police forces set off to investigate, but 30 minutes later a bomb exploded outside the Boots branch in Warrington. Another exploded a few minutes later in just the area the shoppers were fleeing to. The bombs had been left in cast-iron litter bins which produced a hail of deadly shrapnel. A 3-year-old boy was killed instantly, and a 12-year-old seriously wounded and died 5 days later. 54 more were injured, 4 of them seriously. The next day, an IRA statement deplored the tragic and deeply regrettable death and injuries, but blamed the British government, who they claimed deliberately failed to act on precise and adequate warnings. The attack in Warrington came a month after an earlier bomb at the town's gasworks, which had caused damage and disruption but no deaths, and was part of a wider campaign to pressure the British government into withdrawing entirely from Northern Ireland by attacking civilian targets on the British mainland. In protest at the bombing, Irish rock band The Cranberries penned what would, the following September, be released as Zombie, their biggest hit. France went to the polls on the day of the Brazilian Grand Prix to deliver the ruling Socialist Party of President Mitterrand a thorough kicking. The Socialists went from 260 seats in the National Assembly to 54, while a coalition of the Gaullist Rally for the Republic and the centre-right Union for French Democracy had 460 between them. Prime Minister Pierre Bérégovoy, a personal friend of Guy Ligier and a driving force behind the creation of the Manicourt circuit in his home district, had been mired in financial scandal ever since taking over from Edith Cresson the previous March, while jockeying for position between the potential successors to the ageing Mitterrand didn't help the party's image either. Jacques Chirac, the leader of the largest of the two coalition parties, the Rally, indicated that, having already served 2 years as Mitterrand's PM between 1986 and 88, he didn't want to go through all that again, and indeed was preparing for a tilt at the presidency himself. And so on his recommendation, Edouard Balladur, who had been Chirac's finance minister during that administration, was chosen as the new French Prime Minister instead. And the 1993 PPG IndyCar World Series got underway in Australia at the street circuit at Surfers Paradise on Queensland's Gold Coast. Nigel Mansell turned heads by putting his Newman Haas on pole at the first attempt, ahead of the Penske pair of Emerson Fittipaldi and Paul Tracy. Unused to rolling starts, he fell behind early on, then wrecked his tyres catching up, was penalised for what would have been a very spectacular late braking manoeuvre if he hadn't done it under yellow flags, and he nearly ran out of fuel at the end, but somehow still came through to lead Emo home by 5 seconds. He was the first driver since Graham Hill in 1966 to win on his IndyCar debut, and Hill hadn't done it from pole. That had been taken by Mansell's current teammate Mario Andretti. It had certainly been an impressive debut for Mansell, but Surfers was the kind of street circuit he was used to. The next race would be a stiffer test, the Valvoline 200 on the Phoenix Oval. The fortnight between the South African and Brazilian races saw Alain Prost's hearing with the FISA World Council that, to no one's great surprise, acquitted the Frenchman. Whatever he may have said, to ban the hot favourite for several races would be seen as blatant manipulation to get a closer title fight and would probably damage F1's image as much as whatever it was Prost had said. Over at McLaren there was less certainty, with Sena still refusing to say whether he would drive in Brazil, much to the consternation of the mayor of Sao Paolo, Paulo Maluf, who was looking at a financial disaster if the hometown hero wasn't present. He, prompted by Bernie Ecclestone, who was also keen to get the situation resolved, contacted Senna's agents to no avail. Rumours flew. Senna had signed a 2-year deal. Senna had signed a 1-year deal. Senna insisted on a new engine. Senna was happy with the Ford V8. In the end, 5 days before the race, as flights were beginning to leave the UK for Brazil, Senna agreed, just as at Kyalami, to a one-race deal for $750,000, and he and Ron would pick up negotiations when they got back. All eyes turned to Steve Parker, the new head of Ford's F1 programme, who reaffirmed that Benetton were the works team, and that while Ford were quite happy for different teams to partner with different fuel manufacturers and so on, equal terms for McLaren was not on the table. When someone said that McLaren had Senna and more winning potential, Parker retorted that Benetton had Schumacher, who was just as good and younger. Flavio Briatore was naturally having none of it either, pointing out that Benetton had taken on Ford as a works engine supplier when nobody else was interested after the Haas-Lola debacle, and suddenly now the engine had come good, everyone wanted a piece of it. With Senna's attendance at Interlagos secured and a late surge at the ticket office underway, Eccleston and Mayor Maloof sat down to talk about the future of the Brazilian Grand Prix. Bernie agreed to extend the contract with Interlagos to 1999, but on the condition that major renovations were carried out, with the city of Sao Paolo's share coming to some $8 million, no small sum in a country hard hit by recession. And this year's race had proved just how dependent the ticket sales were on there being a Brazilian driver to cheer on. In fact, all three Brazilians in the race were natives of Sao Paolo, with an interesting dynamic between the two young pretenders. Christian Fittipaldi, the scion of a wealthy family of racing royalty, born in the wealthy Morumbi district, while Rubens Barrichello, already nicknamed Rubinho, was a working-class kid from the Interlagos district. All three were on good terms, though Senna seemed to have taken a particular shine to Rubinho and had taken him under his wing somewhat. Despite growing up within earshot of the circuit, because Rubens had done the majority of his racing career in Europe, this was actually only the second time he'd ever driven at Interlagos in anger. The March team had failed to find a buyer or any more money, and withdrew from the championship between races. Founded among others by Max Mosley and Robin Hurd, the team had debuted in 1970 and raced until 1977 before withdrawing, returned for an unsuccessful stint in 1980 and 81, before selling up to Ram, then returned with Leighton House backing in 1987. All in all, 16 seasons as a works entry, if you include the 2 years of officially being called Leighton House, with 2 wins to its name, one a surprise win for Vittorio Brambilla in the Austrian Rain in 1975, and one for Ronnie Peterson at Monza the following year, plus a win for Jackie Stewart in a March chassis run by Tyrrell Racing at Jarama in 1970. It wasn't the first time March had disappeared from the grid, though, and with Max Mosley now in a very influential position, there was a good chance they'd be back at some point. Larousse nearly didn't make it to Interlagos either. The promised 54 million francs from Pierre Beregavoy's tobacco patch fund hadn't arrived, possibly because there was an election upcoming which he was widely expected to lose. After much pleading, 30 million francs was paid, which would allow them to survive, not to live, according to a glum Philippe Alliot. But they were there, and that was the main thing. Elsewhere, both McLaren and Benetton would run without active suspension, which seemed to be drawing too much power from the Ford V8, which wouldn't help their cause on the bumps of Interlagos, though Tag at least thought they'd fixed the bug that was affecting Senna's suspension in South Africa. Lola had reworked the suspension and rear wings of its car in pursuit of a bit more pace, and Lotus had appointed a new sporting director in the shape of Trevor Foster, a former Shadow and Tyrrell mechanic, most recently active with Jordan's F3000 team. It was also expected to be the last race for the interim Benetton B193A and Footwork FA13B cars before new models were brought in for the European season. With the entry reduced to 26 cars, FISA had originally announced that the starting grid would be reduced to 24, but a petition went round the teams asking for it to be raised to 25, which would mean every team would get to race while keeping at least some jeopardy in qualifying, and this was accepted. For future races, it was also noted that when the grid dropped to 26 or fewer cars, a clause in the rules permitted teams to run a third competitive car, which might be an option for McLaren, who weren't short of cash and had an eager and talented third driver in the shape of Mika Hakkinen waiting in the wings. With the main competition hamstrung by lack of both active suspension and top-end power compared to the V10 Renault, Alain Prost dominated qualifying, a second clear of second-placed Hill on Friday and within a tenth of Mansell's 1992 pole time, but Damon rallied on Saturday to narrow the deficit to just 0.063 seconds and would line up for his first front-row start, with the disconsolate Sena third, but just over 1.8 seconds adrift of Prost, with Schumacher fourth and Andretti a much improved fifth, alongside Patrese, the Italian, 3.1 seconds off pole. Row 4 was all black, with Leto ahead of Wendlinger, with Alesi back in ninth after a litany of technical problems, alongside the understeering Ligier of Blundell. Alliot did well again in 11th in the Larousse, that Lamborghini V12 power quite useful on the Interlagos track, ahead of Herbert, with Berger only managing 13th after his active suspension failed and threw him violently off, and he had to use the spare car set up for Alesi to qualify in. Local boy Barrichello, the youngest man on the grid, was 15th despite a gearbox failure on Friday, with Fittipaldi 20th, the Minardi's passive hydraulic suspension just not enjoying the bumps one little bit. While 21st was a distinct improvement for Luca Badoer ahead of the Tyrrells, Barbazza's Minardi and Alboretto's Lola, which had had setup problems, with a thoroughly demoralised Ivan Capelli the sole non-qualifier, 3/10 off the back, 2 seconds off his teammate Barrichello and nearly 6 off pole. Rain had been threatening all weekend, and on Sunday morning the track was drenched by a sudden downpour, so the morning warm-up was mostly spent dialling in wet settings. In the event, though, the track had dried completely by the time the cars assembled on the grid, though high humidity and dark clouds threatened another storm during the race, just like in South Africa. The stands were relatively sparsely populated compared to previous years, with just 32,000 in attendance after Senna's late decision left many unable to make it in time, but those that were there seemed keen to make enough noise to make up for it. Luca Badoer undid his good qualifying by stalling on the formation lap and would line up at the back, and then they were ready to go. The sky remained overcast, but a low chance of rain was forecast, as Prost got ready to see if he could make it 7 wins in Brazil to Senna's 1. The lights went green and away they went, Prost getting away well and Senna getting alongside Hill, but behind them a blur of white and red as Michael Andretti, wrong-footed by Leto's start, cut across in front of Berger and got harpooned, going backwards into the tyres and nearly flipping right over before landing almost on top of Gerhardt's Ferrari. Both cars were out, while Prost led Senna, Hill, a fast-starting Alesi, Schumacher, Leto, Patrese and Wendlinger through lap 1. Further round the lap there were 2 more casualties, as Brundle spun off at Subida dos boxes and was hit by Barbazza and demolished his Minardi in the process. Prost, with Senna still hot on his heels meanwhile, was pulling away from Hill in third, as Andretti was taken off to the medical centre complaining of back pain and given an X-ray. He was fine. And on lap 3 the list of retirements went up to 5 as Patrese trailed in to retire with a hydraulic fluid leak. Prost was leaving Senna behind too by then, with 3 seconds between himself and the McLaren, who was in turn the same distance ahead of Hill, with Schumacher closing in on him. Both Damon and Michael were actually gaining on Senna, who was finding the balance of his car not to his liking, while further back and mostly off camera, Alesi and Leto were having an entertaining scrap over 5th. Before long there was a 3-way fight between Senna, Hill and Schumacher, while Prost was disappearing at a rate of a second a lap in front of them. Hill was pressuring Senna hard and on lap 11 got inside going into the Senna S to take second place. So a Williams won too as Hill pulled away and Schumacher set about taking third off the local hero. Further back the Alesi-Leto battle had been joined by Wendlinger too, the director opting to go picture-in-picture to follow both of the battles for a while, as Alesi, having to throw everything at the track in an attempt just to keep Leto behind him, nearly went sideways at the end of the pit straight. The next lap the Sauber was through as Alesi fishtailed again, while the Senna-Schumacher battle passed the stricken Jordan of Rubens Barrichello, whose gearbox had packed up on the climb up to the pits. The sky was beginning to get more and more overcast, as Senna lapped Comas, who'd served a 10-second penalty for overtaking Warwick under yellow flags, going past Barrichello's car as Rubens trudged back on foot. Ironically, Senna had also passed Comas under the yellow flags. Fittipaldi passed Warwick for 12th in front of the stand on lap 18 to great acclaim, while Schumacher continued harassing the other Brazilian left in the race. Raindrops were now beginning to fall in the pit lane as Alesi was trying to fight off Wendlinger. Senna was able to pull away from Schumacher a bit when the Benetton was balked by Alboretto's Lola, but Michael was soon back on the McLaren's tail, demonstrating how much faster he could have been going. And he soon had the chance because on lap 24, Senna peeled in to take a 10-second penalty for overtaking Comas under yellow flags. He boiled back out, having only lost third to Schumacher with Leto some way back still. On the same lap, Prost robbed Sultan the wound by sitting fastest lap. And then, on lap 27 of 71, the heavens opened. Out came the red and yellow flags, with the top half of the circuit wet and the rain only getting harder. Senna came straight back in for wet tyres as it continued lashing down. Notorious rain-hater Prost looked like he was slowing for the pits, only to keep going after all, and Hill came in instead. On the main straight, both Suzuki and Katayama aquaplaned off, both unhurt, but with debris everywhere. The SC board went out. The safety car would for the first time be deployed, as Charlie Whiting climbed into the Fiat Tempra that had been earmarked for the job. Prost tiptoed back round, but something was up with his radio, and he thought the team were telling him Damon was in the pits, so he stayed out for another lap, as a whole parade of cars came in to change to wets. Before Prost could make it back round, though, Fittipaldi spun in front of him at the Sena S, and the leader simply aquaplaned right into him, taking both cars out to the delirious cheers of the Brazilian crowd. Because Prost was out, not because Fittipaldi was out. Finally, the safety car headed out onto the track, and new race leader Damon Hill, just his 4th Grand Prix start, remember, would have the job of following it round and collecting everyone else behind him, with overtaking forbidden while it was deployed. The fans continued going berserk as Ayrton Senna was now right behind Hill, with only Derek Warwick's footwork between them, so when the race restarted, once the marshals had finally shifted the wrecks on the main straight, the local hero would have a pretty good shot at taking the lead. The sun came back out again, the rain stopped almost as quickly as it had started, and by lap 36, almost exactly half distance, with the wrecked cars finally removed and the debris cleared, the track was already getting quite dry. The order as the safety car prepared to come back in and restart the race was Hill, Senna, Schumacher, Alesi, Herbert and Leto. Out came the green flag to indicate the race restarting. Charlie Whiting brought the Fiat back into the pits, and away they went again. So, no pressure on Damon Hill, in his first ever racing laps in the lead of a race, taking his first ever rolling start in Formula 1. Senna was straight past Warwick on the straight, but Hill was able to stay ahead through the Sena S, the only parts of the track still wet, as Schumacher took a little longer getting past the footwork and dropped back from the leader. It was Herbert the first man in for slicks at the end of the restart lap, as Hill, having successfully held off Senna, used his power advantage to draw away once more. Senna, with nothing to lose really, took the gamble and was in for slicks on lap 41, followed in and out by Schumacher, whose stop was delayed by a problem on the rear jack. Next lap it was Hill in from the lead, which meant that Alesi now led, but a quick stop from the Williams crew put him out just ahead of Senna, who, with a combination of warmer tyres and sheer motivation, took second place, which became the lead when Alesi made his own stop. As Senna came past in the lead for the first time to begin lap 44, the crowd went predictably ballistic, but Johnny Herbert had also benefited from his gamble and was running third ahead of Leto, Alesi and Blundell, who'd also stopped. And Schumacher? He'd been slapped with a 10-second penalty for overtaking under yellows and was down in 9th place. The Ferrari team's weekend went from bad to worse when Alesi was called in for a 20-second penalty for overtaking both Herbert and Leto under yellow flags, and then another 10 seconds on lap 51 for passing Comas just before the green flag, as the leaders passed a rolling De Cesaris, his Yamaha engine losing all its electrics. So that put Zanardi up into the points, and it was shaping up to be a pretty encouraging weekend for Lotus with 21 laps to go. Hill was still with Senna, setting a new fastest lap in his pursuit, but as they came through traffic it was, as so often in the past, the Brazilian who was quicker disposing of the back markers and able to get away. Leto's electrics went on lap 52, promoting Blundell to 4th, while Michael Schumacher was charging back up the field, passing Zanardi for 6th, which then became 5th with Leto's departure. The driver of the number 11 Lotus, in fact, would drive the last 20 laps or so, mostly with one hand, because a loose stone chipping had been pinged up and caught him in the neck. Schumacher's charge took him up to Blundell's rear wing, setting a series of fastest laps, with Damon having seemingly settled for second as Senna pulled away, and Wendlinger dropped out off-screen with an engine problem. Schumacher set about the Ligier ahead of him, and Blundell put up a good fight before succumbing at the end of the main straight. With 8 laps to go, Schumacher now set off in pursuit of Herbert and the podium. By now, Senna led Hill by over 18 seconds, with a similar gap back to Herbert, who suddenly had his mirrors full of yellow Benetton, just like his countryman Blundell had. And just like Blundell, Herbert was not in a mood to yield, particularly with his first ever podium finish, within touching distance. Schumacher got by at the end of the back straight, only for Herbert to duck inside, undercut him into Subito de Lago. Great stuff. 2 laps to go, and with Senna looking nailed on to win in front of his adoring fans. Schumacher got in front of Herbert again as they began lap 70, breaking super late into the Sena S, and this time he made it stick, taking that podium place as Senna began his triumphal last lap, the crowd almost drowning out the sound of the screaming Ford V8. Waving to the crowd as he went, a dangerous move, just ask Nigel Mansell, he cruised round to take the checkered flag for his 37th Grand Prix win and McLaren's 100th as a constructor. Stopping as soon as he crossed the line to pick up a flag, the ESPN coverage cuts away just in time to see him handed the black colours of Banco do Brasil, the chief rival of his own personal sponsor Banco Nacional. He quickly swapped it for a national flag, but just like Mansell at Silverstone the year before, he wasn't going to go any further in his McLaren as the crowd surged onto the track. When God wants something to happen, nothing can change it, he later said. Damon Hill took an excellent second place, a fine way to score your first points in F1, with Schumacher a delighted third after a fine comeback drive. Johnny Herbert would probably have snapped your hand off for fourth before the race, but will have been disappointed to lose third so close to the finish, with Blundell scoring again for the resurgent Ligier team, and Zanardi scoring his first F1.2 in trying circumstances to make it a good day for Lotus. Alio was seventh after a solid race when those around him spun or got penalised, followed by Alesi, Warwick, Comas, both Larousses in the top 10, and the two Lolas, still running but both a lap behind everyone else and 3 laps behind Senna. Not only had Senna won the race, but he'd taken the lead of the Drivers' Championship into the bargain thanks to Prost's misfortune, while McLaren and Williams were now tied at the top of the Constructors' table with 16 each. It was a long way to go yet, of course, but maybe it wasn't going to be a Williams whitewash after all. Much would depend, of course, on whether Senna was still at the wheel of his McLaren in 2 weeks' time in the English Midlands.